The overturned stagecoach lay twisted against the red rocks of Devil's Canyon like a broken toy, its wheels still spinning lazily in the desert wind. Kate Sullivan pressed her face against the scorching sand, tasting blood and fear as she tried to move her legs. Nothing. The sensation ended abruptly at her waist, as if someone had drawn a line across her body with invisible ink. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Above her, vultures circled in the merciless Arizona sun, their shadows dancing across her torn blue traveling dress. The other passengers lay motionless around the wreckage, their dreams of new beginnings scattered like the contents of split luggage across the unforgiving landscape. Emma's teaching certificate from Boston Normal School fluttered past her face, caught in a dust devil that spoke of coming storms. She had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met, carrying nothing but hope and her medical training. Now she lay paralyzed in Apache territory, listening to the distant war drums that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder from an angry god. The sound of hoofbeats cut through her despair. A lone rider appeared at the canyon's rim, silhouetted against the burning sky. Emma tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper. The rider paused, scanning the devastation below, and for a heart-stopping moment she thought he might ride away. Then he spurred his horse down the treacherous slope, rocks cascading before him like a landslide of destiny. Benjamin Murphy had been tracking stolen cattle for 3 days, following a trail that led deeper into the most dangerous territory in Arizona. The last thing he expected to find was a woman in a torn dress, her green eyes blazing with determination despite the tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Ben dismounted with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle, his weathered hands already reaching for the canteen at his hip. At 35, he'd seen enough death in this territory to recognize it from a distance. But something about the woman's steady gaze told him this wasn't over yet. Her spine remained straight despite her obvious pain, and her fingers clutched a leather medical bag as if it contained her last connection to the world she'd known. The stagecoach driver was beyond help, an arrow through his chest speaking to the efficiency of whoever had orchestrated this attack. The other passengers, a mining engineer and his wife, had died on impact when the coach rolled. But this woman, this stranger with the educated accent and gentle hands, had somehow survived the fall that should have killed her. "Ma'am, I'm Benjamin Murphy," he said, kneeling beside her in the shade of the overturned coach. "Can you tell me your name?" Kate Sullivan," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I was traveling to Wilcox to marry Mr. Harold Pemberton. Are you familiar with him?" Ben's jaw tightened. He knew Pemberton, knew him as a man who collected mail-order brides like other men collected cattle, discarding them when they proved inconvenient or expensive. 3 women had come to marry Pemberton in the past 2 years. None had stayed longer than a month. "I know him," Ben said carefully. "Right now, though, we need to get you somewhere safe. This is Cochise's hunting ground, and those drums mean they're close." Emma tried again to move her legs, her face going white with the effort. "I can't feel anything below my waist." The coach rolled, and something struck my back. "I have medical training from Boston Women's Hospital, enough to know what this means." The implications hung between them in the desert heat. A paralyzed woman in Apache territory was as good as dead, and they both knew it. But Ben had spent 15 years carving a life from this hostile land, and he'd learned that surrender was a luxury no one could afford. He studied her face, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the way she'd automatically checked the other passengers for signs of life despite her own condition. This wasn't a woman who gave up easily. "I've got a ranch about 20 miles north of here, and a 6-year-old nephew who lost his parents to typhoid last winter. I've been managing alone, but it's not working. The boy needs a woman's care, and I need help running the place." Emma's eyes widened. "Mr. Murphy, I believe my legs are broken. I may never walk again. Can you use your hands? Can you cook, teach a child to read, help with the books?" She nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in her green eyes. "You're asking me to marry you. I'm asking you to consider it. Pemberton won't want a wife who can't work his fields or bear his children. I've got a good spread, water rights, and enough cattle to make a living. What I don't have is someone to help me raise Timothy or manage the household accounts." The war drums grew louder, closer. In the distance, smoke signals rose from the peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, carrying messages in a language older than the white man's claims to this land. Emma's medical bag had spilled open beside her, revealing surgical instruments, morphine, and bottles of medicines that would be worth their weight in gold in this isolated territory. Ben realized she wasn't just educated. She was trained in skills that could mean the difference between life and death for his family and neighbors. "Mr. Murphy, if I agree to this arrangement, what assurance do I have that you won't abandon me the first time my condition becomes inconvenient?" Ben met her steady gaze. "My word, Miss Sullivan, and the knowledge that I've spent the last year watching my nephew fade away because he needs more than I can give him. You'd be saving his life as much as I'd be saving yours." The sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls. Apache riders moving fast and with purpose. Ben's hand dropped to his rifle, but he knew they were vastly outnumbered. "Miss Sullivan, I need an answer now. We can have the preacher at Fort Bowie marry us tonight if we can make it there alive." Emma closed her eyes for a moment, perhaps thinking of the classroom she'd never teach, the children she'd never bear, the normal life that had died with her legs in this god-forsaken canyon. When she opened them again, her voice was clear and strong. "Yes, Mr. Murphy, I'll marry you." Ben nodded once and began gathering her scattered belongings, stuffing them into his saddlebags with the efficiency of a man accustomed to making life or death decisions quickly. He fashioned a travois from the coach's broken wheel and his own saddle blanket, working with the practiced movements of someone who'd learned to make do with whatever was at hand. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lifted Emma onto the makeshift stretcher. She gasped at the pain but didn't cry out. Her fingers found his arm, gripping with surprising strength. "Mr. Murphy, there's something else you should know. I have $30 in gold sewn into my corset, and my medical training includes surgical procedures. If we survive this, I can contribute more than just household management." Ben secured her to the travois, his movements gentle despite the urgency. "Emma Kate Sullivan, I believe you might be the answer to prayers I didn't know I was praying." The Apache war party crested the ridge, just as Ben mounted his horse and began pulling the travois toward the narrow deer trail that led out of the canyon. 20 warriors on painted horses, their faces streaked with war paint that spoke of raids and revenge. They saw the white man and his burden, and their war cries split the desert air like the screams of hunting eagles. Ben's horse, a steady bay gelding named Courage, had been bred for this country and trained for moments like this. The animal seemed to understand the stakes as he picked his way up the treacherous trail, the travois bouncing and sliding behind him on the loose shale. Emma gripped the sides of the stretcher, her knuckles white with effort, but her voice remained calm. "How far to Fort Bowie?" 15 miles through country that'll test everything we've got," Ben replied, not taking his eyes off the trail ahead. "But there's a hidden spring about halfway there. Place the Apache consider sacred. They might not follow us there." An arrow whispered past Ben's ear, close enough that he could hear the fletching sing in the wind. He urged Courage faster, knowing that speed was their only hope now. The travois bucked and jumped over the rocky ground, and he could hear Emma's sharp intakes of breath as each jolt sent fresh waves of pain through her injured spine. Behind them, the Apache riders had reached the base of the trail and were beginning their pursuit. They rode like centaurs, part of their horses, flowing over the landscape with a grace that spoke of generations of warfare in this unforgiving land. Ben knew these mountains like a man knows his own heartbeat. He'd hunted here, hidden here, and fought here during the long years of conflict that had defined his adult life. Every trail, every water source, every defensible position was mapped in his memory with the precision of a surveyor's instrument. The trail forked ahead, one path leading toward Fort Bowie through open country where they'd be sitting targets, the other winding deeper into the mountains toward the sacred spring. Ben chose the second path without hesitation, gambling their lives on Apache superstition and his own knowledge of their customs. Emma's medical bag bounced beside her on the travois, its contents rattling with each step. She managed to grab one of the bottles and hold it steady, reading the label even as the world bounced around her. "Mr. Murphy, if we reach safety, I need you to know that my paralysis might not be permanent. The pain suggests nerve compression rather than complete severing. With time and proper treatment, I might regain some function." Ben felt a strange lightening in his chest at her words. He'd been prepared to marry a woman who would never walk again, but the possibility of recovery changed nothing about his commitment to her safety. The hidden spring lay nestled in a grove of ancient cottonwoods, their leaves whispering secrets that predated the first Spanish conquistadors. The water bubbled up from deep in the earth, clear and cold, forming a small pool that reflected the sky, like a mirror made of liquid sapphire. Ben pulled the travois into the shade and helped Emma drink from his canteen. The Apache war cries had faded behind them, replaced by the peaceful sound of wind through the leaves and the gentle murmur of flowing water. "Why did they stop pursuing us?" Emma asked, her voice stronger now that the immediate danger had passed. "This is a holy place for them. They believe the spirits of their ancestors guard this spring. Most Apache won't shed blood here unless they're defending it from desecration." Emma looked around at the peaceful grove, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You're gambling that their spiritual beliefs are stronger than their desire for revenge. I'm gambling that even in war, some things remain sacred." As if to prove his point, a lone Apache warrior appeared at the edge of the grove. He was older than the others, his face marked with the scars of many battles, his bearing that of a man accustomed to command. He studied them for a long moment, taking in the injured woman and the man who'd chosen respect over expedience. The warrior raised his hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning, then melted back into the landscape as silently as he'd appeared. The message was clear: they could stay until sunset, but then they must leave this sacred ground. Ben used the respite to check Emma's injuries more thoroughly, his hands gentle but thorough as he examined her spine for signs of swelling or displacement. His years of treating injured cattle and horses had given him a practical knowledge of anatomy that complemented her medical training. "The injury is here," Emma said, guiding his fingers to a spot just below her ribs. "I can feel pressure but no sharp pain. That's encouraging." Ben nodded, filing away the information for future reference. "We'll get you to the fort before dark. The surgeon there served in the war, he'll know what to do." As the afternoon shadows grew longer, they prepared to leave their sanctuary. Ben had fashioned a more comfortable harness for the travois, using strips of leather from his saddle, and Emma had organized her medical supplies for easy access. The trail to Fort Bowie led through a series of narrow passes that would force them to travel single file, exposed and vulnerable. But it was the only route that offered any hope of reaching safety before the Apache decided their temporary sanctuary had expired. Ben helped Emma secure herself on the travois one more time, checking each strap and buckle with the attention to detail that had kept him alive in this hostile land for 15 years. "Ready, Miss Sullivan. Ready, Mr. Murphy. And Benjamin, thank you for not leaving me to die in that canyon." Ben mounted courage and took up the leads of the travois. "Emma, Kate, we're partners now. Partners don't abandon each other, not in this country." As they left the sacred grove behind, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that spoke of endings and beginnings. Ahead lay Fort Bowie, civilization, and the promise of a wedding that would bind two strangers together in a partnership forged by necessity and tempered by the unforgiving truth of the frontier. Behind them, the cottonwoods whispered their ancient secrets to the wind, and somewhere in the gathering shadows, Apache Eye watched the white man and his burden disappear into the maze of canyons that led toward tomorrow. Part 2: The Journey to Fort Bowie. The trail wound through red sandstone cliffs that rose like cathedral walls on either side, their surfaces carved by wind and time into shapes that suggested sleeping giants and forgotten gods. Emma gripped the sides of the travois as it navigated the narrow passage, each bump and jar sending fresh waves of sensation through her damaged spine. The pain was almost welcome now, a sign that her nerves were still fighting to reconnect the broken pathways in her body. Ben guided courage with the steady confidence of a man who'd memorized every stone and shadow in these mountains. His rifle lay across his saddle, loaded and ready, though he knew that in these narrow defiles, a single Apache warrior could hold off an entire cavalry troop. Their safety lay not in firepower, but in speed and the fading light that would soon cloak their movement in blessed darkness. The desert air carried the scent of sage and creosote, mixed with the metallic tang of approaching rain. Storm clouds gathered over the distant peaks, their dark bellies pregnant with the kind of flash flood that could turn a dry wash into a raging torrent in minutes. Ben urged courage faster, knowing they needed to clear the canyon before the first drops fell. Emma had grown quiet during the journey, her earlier determination replaced by the grim reality of their situation. She was a woman of science, trained to diagnose and treat, and she couldn't ignore the symptoms her own body was presenting. The complete loss of sensation below her waist suggested severe spinal trauma, possibly permanent. Yet something deep in her medical knowledge whispered that hope might not be entirely lost. "Mr. Murphy," she called softly, her voice barely audible over the clatter of hooves on stone. "How much do you know about Dr. Harrison at Fort Bowie?" "Enough to know he's the best surgeon between here and San Francisco." Ben replied without turning around. "Served as a field medic during the war, seen every kind of injury a man can survive. If anyone can help you, it's him." Emma nodded, filing away this information like a prescription written for future hope. She'd studied under some of the finest physicians in Boston, learned surgical techniques that were still considered experimental in most of the country. If Dr. Harrison possessed similar knowledge and experience, perhaps her condition wasn't the death sentence it appeared to be. The canyon opened suddenly into a broad valley dotted with Joshua trees and beryl cacti, their twisted forms creating an alien landscape that seemed more suited to another world than the one Emma had known in Massachusetts. To the north, the walls of Fort Bowie rose from the desert floor like a promise of civilization carved from adobe and determination. But between them and safety lay 5 miles of open ground, exposed under the dying light of day. Ben studied the valley with the eyes of a hunter, noting the places where Apache warriors might conceal themselves, the gullies and rock formations that could hide in ambush. The silence was too complete, too perfect. Even the desert birds had stopped their evening songs. "Something's wrong," Ben murmured, more to himself than to Emma. "This valley should be alive with sound at sunset." Emma strained to listen, her medical training having taught her to pay attention to details others might miss. The absence of normal desert noise was indeed ominous, like a patient whose heartbeat had grown too faint to detect. A dust devil spun across their path, carrying with it the scent of horses and gun oil. Ben's hand tightened on his rifle as he recognized the signs of a recent military patrol. Fresh wheel ruts in the sand told the story of supply wagons, while scattered horse droppings indicated a sizable cavalry unit had passed this way within the last few hours. "Soldiers," Emma observed, having noticed the same signs. "Recent ones. Which means either very good news or very bad news." Ben replied grimly. "If they're hunting Apache, it means the situation's worse than I thought. If they're just running supplies, we might catch up with them for an escort." The decision was made for them when the sharp crack of rifle fire echoed across the valley, followed by the distinctive war cries of Apache raiders. Smoke rose from a cluster of rocks about 2 miles ahead, where the remnants of a supply wagon burned like a funeral pyre against the darkening sky. Ben weighed their options with the cold calculation of a man who'd survived 15 years in hostile territory. They could try to circle around the battle, adding hours to their journey through country that would be crawling with Apache war parties. Or they could press forward and hope to link up with any surviving soldiers who might provide protection for the final approach to the fort. Emma, I need you to understand what we're riding into, Ben said, turning in his saddle to meet her eyes. There's a fight ahead, and we might not make it through. If something happens to me, you take courage and ride straight for the fort. Don't stop for anything or anyone. Emma's jaw set with the same determination that had carried her through medical school against the wishes of her family and society. Mr. Murphy, I didn't survive a stagecoach crash to die of cowardice in a desert valley. Whatever's ahead, we face it together. Ben felt something shift in his chest at her words, a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert heat. This woman, broken and helpless though she might appear, possessed a core of steel that reminded him why he'd been drawn to the frontier in the first place. Out here, courage mattered more than convention, and character counted for more than circumstance. They approached the burning wagon with the caution of wolves circling a campfire. The vehicle had been military, its canvas top now a blazing beacon that sent smoke signals of its own into the evening sky. Around it lay the bodies of 4 soldiers, their blue uniforms stained with blood and desert dust. But movement in the rocks beyond told a different story. At least 3 men had taken defensive positions among the boulders, their rifles speaking in measured cadence as they held off the Apache attack. Ben could see muzzle flashes winking like fireflies in the gathering gloom, punctuated by the orange bloom of return fire from the raiders hidden in the surrounding terrain. Sergeant O'Malley, is that you? Ben called out, recognizing the tactical deployment of the defensive position. Murphy, what in blazes are you doing out here? The reply came from behind, a cluster of red rocks, tinged with the Irish accent that marked Patrick O'Malley as one of the few career soldiers who'd made the frontier army his home. Bringing in an injured woman. What's your situation? 3 men, low on ammunition, and about 15 Apache between us and the fort. Could use some help if you're offering. Ben studied the terrain with the eye of a man who'd fought both with and against the cavalry in his younger days. The Apache had positioned themselves well, using the natural rock formations to create interlocking fields of fire that would make any direct assault suicidal. But they'd made one tactical error, leaving their rear flank exposed to the high ground where the old mining trail cut through the hillside. Emma, I need to help those soldiers. Can you handle a rifle? I've never fired one, but I understand the basic mechanics, she replied. Her medical training having included basic anatomy lessons that extended to the engineering of firearms. Ben quickly showed her how to work the lever action and sight down the barrel, though he prayed she wouldn't need to use the knowledge. He positioned the travel behind a large boulder that would provide some protection, then began the dangerous climb toward the high ground that would give him a clear shot at the Apache rear positions. The ascent took him through terrain that seemed designed to break both horses and men, loose shale that shifted underfoot and exposed ledges that offered no margin for error. But Ben had learned his climbing skills from the Apache themselves, during the uneasy truces that sometimes marked the long years of conflict. And he moved with the fluid grace of a man who understood that silence was often more valuable than speed. From his elevated position, Ben could see the full scope of the battle below. The Apache had indeed committed 15 warriors to the attack, confident that their superior numbers and knowledge of the terrain would overwhelm the small group of soldiers. They'd positioned themselves in a classic crescent formation, designed to envelope their enemies and cut off any hope of retreat. Ben's first shot took the Apache war leader in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling from his perch among the rocks. The unexpected attack from behind threw the raiders into momentary confusion, breaking the coordinated assault and giving the soldiers below a chance to press their advantage. Sergeant O'Malley was quick to seize the opportunity, leading his 2 remaining men in a flanking movement that caught the Apache between 2 fires. The battle raged for another 10 minutes, muzzle flashes painting the rocks in stark relief against the darkness, before the surviving raiders melted away into the night like smoke dispersing on the wind. Ben made his way back down to where Emma waited, her knuckles white where she gripped the unfired rifle. She'd watched the entire battle with the clinical detachment of a physician observing surgery, noting the tactics and timing that had turned potential disaster into narrow victory. "Is it over?" she asked as Ben retrieved courage's reins. "For now. Apache don't like to fight at night unless they have overwhelming advantage. We should be safe until dawn." Sergeant O'Malley approached their position, his weathered face creased with concern as he took in Emma's condition and the makeshift travois. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to see you in such straits. What happened?" Emma briefly explained the stagecoach attack, leaving out the personal details of her intended marriage and the arrangement she'd made with Ben. O'Malley listened with the grim attention of a man who'd seen too much frontier violence, nodding at the familiar pattern of raids and ambushes that marked life in Apache territory. "We'll escort you to the fort," O'Malley declared. "It's the least we can do after the help you provided." The final miles to Fort Bowie passed without incident. The small column moving through darkness, lit only by stars and the distant glow of the fort's watchfires. Emma found herself drifting in and out of consciousness, the combination of pain, exhaustion, and laudanum from her medical bag creating a dreamlike state where reality blurred at the edges. She dreamed of Boston classrooms and hospital wards, of the life she'd left behind in pursuit of a future that had died in a desert canyon. But mixed with the grief was something else, a growing awareness of the man who rode ahead of her through the dangerous night, steady and protective as a lighthouse beacon cutting through a storm. Part 3. Fort Bowie and New Discoveries. Fort Bowie materialized from the darkness like a vision of civilization carved from the hostile wilderness, its adobe walls rising 30 feet above the desert floor and punctuated by guard towers, where sentries maintained their eternal watch. Lanterns flickered in the windows of the infirmary, officers' quarters and enlisted barracks, creating a constellation of warm light that promised safety and medical attention for Emma's battered body. Harrison emerged from the hospital as their small procession clattered through the main gate, his gray hair disheveled and his sleeves rolled up from recent surgery. He was a man in his 50s, tall and lean with the kind of steady hands that had saved countless lives during the war between the states and the years of frontier conflict that followed. "Sergeant O'Malley, what have you brought me?" Harrison asked, his trained eye already assessing Emma's condition as Ben carefully lifted her from the travois. "Stagecoach attack victim, sir. This is Miss Emma Sullivan from Boston, and Mr. Benjamin Murphy who rescued her from Devil's Canyon. The lady has sustained spinal injuries and requires immediate attention." Harrison's demeanor shifted into the focused intensity that marked him as a surgeon of exceptional skill. He directed Ben to carry Emma into the infirmary, where oil lamps had been arranged to provide maximum illumination for the examination that would determine her fate. The infirmary was surprisingly well equipped for a frontier outpost, boasting surgical instruments that would have been at home in any Boston hospital, along with supplies of morphine, chloroform, and other medications that Emma recognized from her own training. Harrison had clearly spared no expense in creating a medical facility capable of handling the unique challenges of frontier medicine. "Miss Sullivan, I'm going to examine your spine and test your reflexes," Harrison explained as he helped her onto the examination table. "I need you to tell me exactly what sensations you feel, no matter how slight." Emma nodded, drawing on her medical training to remain objective about her own condition. She described the numbness below her waist, the complete loss of motor function in her legs, and the pattern of pain that suggested nerve compression rather than complete severing. Harrison's examination was thorough and professional, his fingers probing her spine with the delicate touch of a man who understood that the difference between paralysis and recovery often lay in millimeters of displaced bone and swollen tissue. Ben stood nearby, his hat in his hands and worry etched across his weathered features. "The good news," Harrison announced after completing his assessment, "is that I don't believe your spinal cord has been completely severed. The pattern of your symptoms suggests severe bruising and swelling around the vertebrae, which is compressing the nerve pathways." Emma felt her heart leap at the words, though her medical training cautioned her against premature optimism. "What does that mean for my prognosis, doctor?" It means there's hope for partial recovery, possibly even complete recovery with time and proper treatment. The swelling needs to be reduced, and the displaced vertebrae may require surgical realignment. But you're far from a hopeless case. Ben's relief was visible, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since he'd found Emma in the canyon. What kind of treatment are we talking about, Doc? Harrison turned to address both of them, his manner that of a physician delivering news that was neither entirely good nor entirely bad. Miss Sullivan will need to remain here for at least 2 weeks while we monitor the swelling and begin treatment. After that, she'll require months of careful rehabilitation, with someone who understands her condition and can assist with the daily exercises necessary for recovery. The implications hung in the air between them. Emma's arrangement with Ben had been predicated on her ability to contribute to his household despite her injuries. The prospect of months of dependent invalidism changed the equation considerably, and she wouldn't blame him for reconsidering their hasty agreement. "Doctor," Emma said carefully, "I should mention that I have medical training from Boston Women's Hospital. I assisted in surgical procedures and have experience with spinal trauma cases. I could be of help here while I recover, if you're willing." Harrison's eyebrows rose with interest. "Indeed. What's your background?" Emma outlined her education and experience, describing the surgical techniques she'd learned and the innovative treatments for nerve damage that were being developed in Boston's teaching hospitals. Harrison listened with growing respect, recognizing in her knowledge a level of medical sophistication that was rare even among trained physicians on the frontier. "Miss Sullivan, I believe your recovery just became considerably more promising," Harrison said with a smile. "Working with medical cases will provide the mental stimulation necessary to prevent the depression that often accompanies spinal injuries. While your knowledge could prove invaluable to my practice here." Ben had remained quiet during this exchange, but now he stepped forward with the quiet determination that had marked his rescue of Emma from the canyon. "Doc, Miss Sullivan and I have an arrangement. I'm not the kind of man who goes back on his word because circumstances change." Emma turned to look at him, seeing in his steady gray eyes the same steadfast character that had prompted him to risk his life for a stranger. "Benjamin, you didn't agree to care for an invalid for months on end. I wouldn't hold you to such an obligation. Emma Kate Sullivan, when I gave you my word in that canyon, it wasn't conditional on your legs working properly. A partnership is a partnership, in sickness and in health." The phrase carried weight beyond its literal meaning, touching on the marriage vows they'd planned to exchange at the fort's chapel. Harrison looked between them with the knowing expression of a man who'd seen love grow from stranger foundations than mutual necessity and shared danger. "Well then," Harrison said briskly, "I suggest we proceed with both the medical treatment and the wedding ceremony. Chaplain Morrison is available this evening, and Miss Sullivan's condition is stable enough to permit the formalities." An hour later, Emma found herself propped up in the infirmary bed wearing a borrowed dress from the chaplain's wife, while Ben stood beside her in his cleanest shirt and recently brushed coat. The ceremony was simple, witnessed by Dr. Harrison and Sergeant O'Malley. But the words carried the weight of promises made under fire and tested by circumstances neither could have imagined. When Ben kissed his new wife, Emma tasted the salt of desert wind and the promise of a future that remained uncertain but no longer seemed hopeless. They were partners now in truth as well as necessity, bound together by words spoken in lamplight, while the desert wind sang its ancient songs beyond the fort's walls. "Mrs. Murphy," Ben said softly, testing the sound of her new name. "Mr. Murphy," Emma replied, finding that the formal address now carried undertones of intimacy that made her pulse quicken despite her medical condition. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "I hate to interrupt the romantic moment, but we need to discuss Mrs. Murphy's treatment plan and living arrangements during her recovery." Ben had already given this matter considerable thought during the long ride to the fort. "Emma will stay here for the medical treatment she needs. I'll ride back to the ranch tomorrow to make arrangements with my foreman and bring Timothy to meet his new aunt. We'll take rooms in town so I can be close during her recovery." Emma started to protest the expense and inconvenience, but Ben silenced her with a look that brooked no argument. "Emma, you're my wife now. That means your recovery is the most important thing in my world. Everything else can wait." The simple declaration carried more emotional weight than any flowery speech of devotion. Emma had married for practical reasons, but she was beginning to understand that practicality and love weren't mutually exclusive on the frontier. Sometimes the deepest affection grew from shared struggle and mutual respect rather than romantic courtship. Part 4. Threats and Revelations. 3 days into Emma's treatment at Fort Bowie, Harold Pemberton arrived with all the subtlety of a thunderstorm rolling across the desert. He rode through the fort's gates at the head of a small entourage that included his foreman, 2 hired gunmen, and a lawyer from Tucson, whose expensive suit looked absurdly out of place in the military setting. Emma was in the infirmary garden, working through the painful exercises Dr. Harrison had prescribed to maintain muscle tone in her legs, when Pemberton's voice carried across the courtyard like the crack of a bullwhip. "I demand to see the woman who was intended as my bride. There are legal questions regarding her marriage that must be resolved immediately." Ben emerged from the quartermaster's office, where he'd been arranging supplies for his return trip to the ranch. His hand instinctively dropped to his gun belt as he recognized the voice, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. Pemberton was a man who used lawyers and hired guns instead of personal courage, but that made him no less dangerous in the complex web of territorial law and politics. "Mr. Pemberton," Ben said evenly, "I wasn't expecting to see you at a military installation." Pemberton was a man in his early 50s, soft around the middle from good living and hard around the eyes from years of getting his way through intimidation and legal maneuvering. He wore the kind of expensive clothes that marked him as successful, though his success had come at the expense of others less fortunate or well-connected. "Murphy, I understand you've interfered with a legal contract of marriage. Miss Sullivan was bound by agreement to become my wife, and your hasty ceremony has created complications that require immediate resolution." The lawyer stepped forward, a thin man named Whitmore, whose pale complexion suggested he spent more time in law libraries than under the frontier sun. "Mr. Murphy, I represent Mr. Pemberton's interests in this matter. The lady was under legal obligation to honor her marriage contract, and your intervention constitutes tortious interference with said contract." Emma appeared in the doorway of the infirmary, supported by a walking frame that Dr. Harrison had constructed to aid her mobility. Her spine remained straight despite the pain each step caused, and her voice carried the crisp authority of her Boston education when she addressed Pemberton directly. "Miss Pemberton, our correspondence outlined a mutual agreement that was contingent upon both parties finding the arrangement satisfactory upon meeting. As I was unable to meet you due to circumstances beyond my control, and as you made no effort to locate me after the stagecoach attack, I considered our agreement null and void." Pemberton's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. He'd clearly expected to find a desperate, helpless woman who would gratefully accept his belated rescue. Instead, he faced a woman who'd not only survived without him, but had made her own arrangements for the future. "Miss Sullivan, you were damaged goods when Murphy found you. No respectable man would want a crippled wife who can't perform her basic duties. I'm prepared to overlook your condition and honor our original agreement, with certain modifications to reflect your diminished circumstances." The insult hung in the air like the smell of gunpowder after a shot. Ben stepped forward, his gray eyes gone cold as winter steel, but Emma's voice cut through the tension before violence could erupt. "Mr. Pemberton, I am Mrs. Murphy now, and I've never been more grateful for any decision in my life. Mr. Murphy has shown me more respect and consideration in 3 days than you've managed in 3 minutes." Dr. Harrison had emerged from the hospital during this exchange, drawn by the raised voices and the obvious potential for trouble. As the senior officer present, he possessed the authority to maintain order within the fort's boundaries. "Gentlemen, I'm going to have to ask you to conduct this discussion elsewhere. This is a military hospital, and Mrs. Murphy is my patient. Any further disturbance will result in your removal from the premises." Pemberton's lawyer consulted a sheaf of papers from his briefcase, his pale fingers rustling through the documents like a card sharp, shuffling a marked deck. "Doctor, we have legal documents that establish Mr. Pemberton's prior claim to the lady. Territorial law is quite clear on the matter of marriage contracts." Harrison's response revealed a knowledge of frontier law that surprised even Ben. "Mr. Whitmore, territorial law is equally clear, that no marriage contract is valid if entered into under false pretenses, or if circumstances render the original agreement impossible to fulfill. Mrs. Murphy was abandoned after a stagecoach attack in hostile territory. Any reasonable person would consider that grounds for voiding a marriage contract. Emma seized on this point with the quick thinking that had earned her recognition in Boston's medical community. Furthermore, Mr. Pemberton, our correspondence indicated that you required a wife capable of bearing children and managing farm labor. My current medical condition clearly makes me unsuitable for those purposes, which renders our original agreement impractical. Pemberton's foreman, a surly man named Garrett, with the look of someone who'd done his share of dirty work, leaned close to his employer and whispered something that made Pemberton's eyes narrow with calculation. Mrs. Murphy, Pemberton said, his tone shifting to oily persuasion, perhaps we can reach a more amicable arrangement. I'm prepared to offer your husband fair compensation for the expenses he's incurred in your care, plus a consideration for his trouble. $500 in gold, and we'll call the matter settled. The offer revealed more about Pemberton's character than any investigation could have uncovered. He saw Emma as property to be purchased rather than a person with rights and choices of her own. The casual way he discussed buying her like a piece of livestock made Ben's trigger finger itch with barely suppressed violence. Mr. Pemberton, Ben said with deadly quiet, my wife is not for sale at any price. I suggest you and your associates leave this fort before I forget. I'm a guest here and demonstrate some frontier hospitality. Garrett's hand dropped to his gun butt, a movement that was noticed by every soldier within sight. Sergeant O'Malley appeared as if from nowhere, flanked by two corporals whose rifles were held at the ready. The mathematical superiority of military force quickly became apparent to even Pemberton's hired guns. Mr. Pemberton, O'Malley said in his authoritative Irish brogue, the commanding officer has asked me to inform you that visiting hours are concluded. The main gate will close in 10 minutes, with or without you on the other side of it. Pemberton gathered his dignity around himself like an expensive coat, though his retreat was obvious to everyone present. This matter isn't settled, Murphy. I have interests in this territory that extend beyond one woman. We'll meet again under different circumstances. As Pemberton's party rode away from the fort, Ben felt Emma's hand slip into his with surprising strength. She'd managed to walk from the infirmary to the courtyard without assistance, a sign that Dr. Harrison's treatment was beginning to show results. Benjamin, that man isn't going to give up easily. He has the look of someone who's accustomed to getting what he wants through any means necessary. Ben nodded grimly. I've seen his type before. Men who think the frontier gives them license to take whatever they want without consequences. He'll be back, probably with more men and a different strategy. Dr. Harrison joined them as they watched the dust cloud of Pemberton's departure settle over the desert landscape. Mrs. Murphy, I think it's time you knew something about your former intended husband. He's been the subject of some disturbing reports from other settlements. The physician's words carried the weight of knowledge gained through official channels, the kind of information that circulated among military posts and territorial officials but rarely reached civilian ears. What kind of reports? Emma asked, though her medical training had already made her suspect that Pemberton's interest in mail-order brides went beyond mere loneliness. 3 women have come to marry him in the past 2 years. All of them have disappeared within a month of their arrival. The territorial marshal has been asking questions, but Pemberton has connections in Tucson that make official investigation difficult. The implications of Harrison's words settled over them like the chill of desert night. Emma realized that her paralysis might have saved her life rather than ruining it, and that Ben's rescue had been more than just gallant heroism. Doctor, are you saying that my husband may have prevented my murder as well as saving my life? Harrison's expression was grim as stone. Mrs. Murphy, I'm saying that your marriage to Mr. Murphy was the best decision you've ever made, for more reasons than you might have realized. Part 5. The Ranch and New Beginnings. The journey to Murphy Ranch took 2 days of careful travel through country that seemed designed to test both human endurance and mechanical ingenuity. Emma rode in a specially modified wagon that Ben had commissioned from the fort's carpenter, its bed fitted with springs and padding to cushion the jarring impact of desert roads that were little more than cattle trails scratched into the hard pan. Dr. Harrison had declared her ready for the move after 2 weeks of intensive treatment that had restored some sensation to her upper legs and improved her overall stability. She could stand for short periods with assistance and had regained enough core strength to manage basic daily activities, though full recovery remained months away. Ben rode alongside the wagon on courage, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding landscape for signs of trouble. Pemberton's threats had not been idle ones, and reports from other ranchers suggested increased Apache activity in the region. The combination of Indian raids and Pemberton's obvious ill intentions created a dangerous mixture that kept Ben's rifle loaded and ready. Timothy Murphy emerged from the ranch house as their small caravan approached, a 6-year-old boy with his uncle's gray eyes and his late father's stubborn chin. He'd been living with the ranch foreman, Samuel Fletcher, during Ben's absence, but the arrangement had been temporary at best. The boy needed more than cowboys could provide, and Emma could see in his shy demeanor the effects of too much loss and uncertainty. The ranch itself was more substantial than Emma had expected, its adobe buildings arranged around a central courtyard that provided protection from both weather and potential attackers. The main house boasted glass windows, wooden floors, and furniture that spoke of comfort earned through hard work rather than inherited wealth. Ben had clearly built something worth defending here in the wilderness. Samuel Fletcher was a man in his 40s, weathered by sun and wind but possessed of the quiet competence that marked the best frontier cowboys. He'd served with Ben during the war, and their partnership had evolved into the kind of unspoken understanding that made words unnecessary in most situations. "Sam, I'd like you to meet my wife, Emma," Ben said as he helped her down from the wagon. "Emma, this is my foreman and oldest friend, Samuel Fletcher." Fletcher removed his hat with old-world courtesy, his lined face creasing into a smile that reached his eyes. "Ma'am, it's an honor to meet you. Ben's told me about your situation, and I want you to know that everyone here will do whatever we can to help with your recovery." Emma appreciated the straightforward acceptance in Fletcher's manner, free from either pity or false cheerfulness. These frontier men seemed to understand that adaptation was more valuable than sympathy, and that practical support meant more than emotional coddling. Timothy hung back near the porch steps, uncertainty warring with curiosity in his young face. Emma had dealt with children during her medical training, and she recognized the careful distance that marked a child who'd learned not to invest too quickly in new relationships. "Timothy, I'm your new Aunt Emma," she said gently, not attempting to approach him but allowing him to maintain the safe distance he needed. "Your Uncle Ben has told me wonderful things about you." The boy's response was barely audible, but Emma caught the mumbled greeting that indicated politeness beaten into him by adult expectations rather than genuine warmth. She filed away this observation for future consideration, understanding that winning Timothy's trust would require patience and consistency rather than immediate affection. Ben carried Emma into the house, setting her carefully on the sofa that dominated the main room. The interior was spartanly furnished but clean and well-maintained, with the kind of practical comfort that marked a bachelor household run by men who understood the basics of survival if not the finer points of domesticity. "It's not much compared to what you're used to," Ben said, a note of uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time since Emma had met him. Emma looked around the room, noting the stone fireplace with its carefully stacked wood, the shelves lined with books that suggested Ben's education extended beyond cattle ranching, and the gun rack that spoke to the realities of frontier life. What she saw was not luxury, but something more valuable, the foundation for a real home. "Benjamin, it's perfect, not because it's grand, but because it's honest. This is a place where people can build something real together." Timothy had followed them inside, though he maintained his careful distance. Emma noticed that he kept his uncle between himself and any adult stranger,
a survival strategy that suggested the boy had learned early that adults could disappear without warning. Timothy, your uncle tells me you're learning to read. I used to teach children in Boston, and I'd be happy to help with your lessons if you'd like. The boy's eyes flickered with interest despite his wariness. Uncle Ben says you know about medicine too. Sam cut his hand last week, and Doc Harrison wasn't here to fix it. Emma smiled at the indirect way Timothy had revealed his interest in her medical knowledge. I do know about medicine. Perhaps sometime I could show you how to clean and bandage wounds properly. It's a useful skill for anyone living on a ranch. Ben watched this careful dance of introduction with growing appreciation for Emma's instinctive understanding of his nephew's needs. She was offering knowledge and skills rather than immediate emotional intimacy, giving Timothy the chance to approach their relationship on his own terms. Fletcher appeared in the doorway with Emma's medical bag, its leather surface dusty from the journey but its contents intact. Ma'am, thought you might want this where you
Could reach it. Had to patch up a cowboy this morning, who tangled with some barbed wire. Emma's interest sharpened immediately. Despite her own limitations, she was still a trained physician, and the opportunity to resume medical practice would provide both intellectual stimulation and practical contribution to the ranch community. What kind of injury? She asked, her professional instincts overriding personal concerns. Deep laceration on his forearm, some embedded wire fragments. I cleaned it best I could, but it probably needs proper stitching. Emma was already reaching for her bag, her hands steady despite the pain that moving caused her spine. Bring him here. I can't walk to him yet, but I can certainly treat him from here. Ben started to protest, concerned about the strain such activity might place on her recovery, but Emma silenced him with a look that reminded him of her professional competence. She might be learning to walk again, but her medical knowledge remained unimpaired. The injured cowboy, a young man named Pete Morrison, submitted to Emma's examination with the stoic acceptance common to men who lived hard lives in dangerous country. She cleaned the wound thoroughly, removed several wire fragments with delicate precision, and sutured the laceration with stitches so neat they would have earned praise from her Boston instructors. Mrs. Murphy, Morrison said as she finished bandaging his arm, that's the finest medical work I've seen since my army days. You've got healing hands. Emma felt a warm glow of satisfaction at the compliment, recognizing in it the validation she'd been seeking since her injury. She might be dependent on others for basic mobility, but her skills as a physician remained intact and valuable. Timothy had watched the entire procedure with fascination, his earlier shyness forgotten in the face of genuine medical drama. Aunt Emma, how did you learn to do that? It looked like sewing, but on a person. Emma smiled at the boy's eager curiosity, seeing in it the beginning of trust that might eventually grow into real affection. It is very much like sewing, Timothy. The human body is remarkably good at healing itself if we give it the right help. As evening approached, Ben built a fire in the main room while Fletcher and Timothy prepared a simple dinner of beef stew and cornbread. Emma found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease, her medical training having taught her to adapt quickly to new situations and unexpected challenges. Benjamin, I need you to understand something, Emma said as they sat together watching the flames dance in the fireplace. I don't want to be treated like an invalid who happens to be useful. I want to be a real partner in building this ranch and raising Timothy. Ben nodded, recognizing in her words the same fierce independence that had first attracted him to her in the desert canyon. Emma, you've already proven yourself a dozen times over. The question isn't whether you're capable, it's how we adjust everything else to accommodate your recovery while you regain your strength. Timothy appeared beside Emma's chair, his young face serious with the weight of a decision he'd been considering all day. Aunt Emma, Uncle Ben said you might stay forever. Is that true? Emma reached out to touch the boy's hand, feeling him tense slightly before gradually relaxing under her gentle contact. Timothy, I hope very much that this will be my home forever. Your uncle and I are married now. Part 6. Building trust and facing dangers. Emma woke to the sound of gunfire crackling across the morning air like the snap of dry kindling in a campfire. She rolled from her bed with movements that were becoming more fluid each day, her legs responding better to her commands as the weeks of recovery progressed. Through the window, she could see Samuel Fletcher crouched behind the water trough, his rifle speaking in measured cadence as he returned fire toward the ridge that overlooked the ranch. Benjamin burst through the bedroom door, his hair disheveled and his gun belt already strapped around his waist. Apache raiding party hit the north pasture at dawn. They've got about 30 head of cattle moving toward the canyon. Emma was already reaching for the Winchester that Ben had taught her to use during the long afternoons of her recovery. Her medical training had given her steady hands and an understanding of anatomy that translated surprisingly well to marksmanship, though she'd never imagined using such skills to defend her home. "How many raiders?" she asked, checking the rifle's action with movements that had become automatic through practice. "Fletcher counts 8, maybe 10. They're good, Emma. This isn't some desperate band looking for easy pickings. These warriors know what they're doing." Timothy appeared in the doorway, his small face pale with fear but his chin set with the same stubborn courage that marked all the Murphy men. Emma's heart clenched at the sight of him trying to be brave when he should have been playing with wooden toys and learning his letters. "Timothy, I need you to help me with something very important," Emma said, forcing her voice to remain calm despite the chaos erupting around them. "Can you load cartridges into these rifle clips while Uncle Ben and Sam protect us?" The boy nodded eagerly, grateful to have a task that made him feel useful rather than helpless. Emma had learned during her weeks at the ranch that Timothy responded better to responsibility than to protection, his young mind already understanding that survival in this country required everyone to contribute according to their abilities. Ben kissed Emma quickly before heading back outside, his gray eyes holding the same steady determination that had marked his rescue of her from the desert canyon. "Keep the rifle ready, but don't expose yourself unnecessarily. These Apache aren't like the desperate bands we usually see. They're organized." Emma positioned herself at the window that offered the best view of the ranch yard, her rifle resting on the sill in a shooting position that accommodated her limited mobility. She could stand for longer periods now, and her upper body strength had returned to near normal levels, making her a capable defender despite her ongoing recovery. The battle that followed was unlike anything Emma had experienced in her sheltered Boston life, yet her medical training had prepared her for violence and blood in ways she hadn't anticipated. She watched Ben and Fletcher move with the coordinated precision of men who'd fought together before, using the ranch buildings and water sources to create overlapping fields of fire that made the Apache assault costly and difficult. The raiders were indeed skilled, using the natural terrain to approach within rifle range while minimizing their exposure to return fire. Emma could see them moving like shadows among the rocks and scrub brush, their painted faces and traditional weapons marking them as warriors from one of the more traditional bands that still rejected accommodation with the white settlements. When one of the Apache warriors broke cover to rush the main house, Emma's rifle spoke without conscious thought on her part. The warrior stumbled and fell, clutching his shoulder where her bullet had found its mark. She felt no satisfaction in wounding another human being, but neither did she feel regret. This was defense of home and family, the most basic right of any person in any land. "Good shot, Aunt Emma," Timothy called from his position near the ammunition boxes, his voice carrying pride and excitement that worried Emma even as it pleased her. She didn't want the boy to find glory in violence, but she understood that frontier children matured quickly or didn't survive to maturity at all. The Apache attack lasted perhaps 20 minutes before the raiders melted away into the landscape as suddenly as they'd appeared. Ben and Fletcher maintained their defensive positions for another hour, waiting to see if the withdrawal was genuine or merely a tactical feint, designed to draw them into an ambush. When the all-clear finally came, Emma made her way outside using the walking stick that Dr. Harrison had crafted for her. The yard showed signs of the brief but intense battle, with bullet holes in the wooden buildings and brass cartridge cases scattered across the dusty ground like golden flowers blooming in the aftermath of violence. "Casualties?" Emma asked, automatically shifting into her medical mindset as she assessed the damage to both property and personnel. Morrison took a bullet graze across his ribs, nothing serious. One of the newer hands, Johnson, caught an arrow in his thigh. "Needs looking at," Fletcher reported with the calm efficiency of a man accustomed to cataloging the costs of frontier conflict. Emma retrieved her medical bag and set up a treatment station on the kitchen table, her movements sure despite the lingering weakness in her legs. Johnson's wound was painful but not life-threatening, the arrow having missed the major blood vessels that could have made it fatal. She cleaned the puncture thoroughly, applied antiseptic that made the young cowboy curse creatively, and bandaged the injury with the professional competence that had earned her recognition in Boston's hospitals. "Mrs. Murphy, you're better than any doctor I've seen," Johnson said as she finished her work. "That arrow felt like it was on fire, but whatever you put on it has it feeling almost normal now." Emma smiled at the compliment, but her mind was already turning to larger concerns. The Apache raid had been too well organized and too precisely targeted to be a random attack. Someone had provided information about the ranch's layout, the number of defenders, and the location of the cattle herds. "Benjamin, we need to talk," she said once she'd finished treating the wounded men. "This attack wasn't spontaneous. Someone told those Apache exactly where to strike and when." Ben's face was grim as he considered her words. He'd reached the same conclusion himself, but hearing it voiced by Emma gave weight to suspicions he'd been reluctant to acknowledge. In frontier communities, accusations of collaboration with hostile Indians were serious matters that could destroy reputations and lives. "You think we've got someone feeding information to the Apache?" Fletcher asked, his lined face creasing with concern. "That's a serious charge, Emma. Not the kind of thing we can investigate without solid proof." Emma had been thinking about this possibility since the first shots were fired, her analytical mind working through the tactical implications of what they'd witnessed. "Sam, how many people knew about our cattle rotation schedule? Who would have known that the North pasture herd would be unguarded this morning?" Fletcher considered the question with the methodical thoroughness that made him valuable as a foreman. "Ranch hands, obviously. Anyone who's worked here in the past month would know our patterns. Plus anyone in town we might have mentioned it to. Could be a dozen people with the right information." Ben's jaw tightened as he realized the scope of the potential problem. "We can't suspect everyone who works for us without destroying the trust that makes this operation possible. But we can't ignore the possibility that someone's selling information to hostile bands." Timothy had been listening to this conversation with the intense attention that children gave to adult discussions they sensed were important. "Uncle Ben, what if the Apache didn't need someone to tell them our schedule? What if they just watched us until they learned it?" Emma felt a flush of pride at the boy's logical thinking, recognizing in his words a possibility that the adults had overlooked in their assumption of betrayal. Timothy's right. Professional warriors would scout their targets carefully before attacking. They might have learned our patterns through observation rather than collaboration. The possibility was both reassuring and disturbing. It meant they probably didn't have a traitor among their own people, but it also suggested that the Apache had been watching the ranch for weeks or even months, gathering intelligence for future raids. "Either way, we need to change our procedures," Ben decided. "Irregular patrol schedules, varied herd rotations, random guard assignments. Make ourselves harder to predict." Emma nodded her agreement, but her medical training had taught her to look for underlying causes rather than merely treating symptoms. "Benjamin, I think this raid might be connected to Harold Pemberton's threats. The timing is too convenient to be coincidental." Ben's eyes sharpened with interest as he considered this possibility. Pemberton had the connections and resources to arrange such an attack, either through direct payment to desperate Apache bands or through more complex political manipulations involving territorial officials and military contractors. "You think Pemberton would use Apache raiders to pressure us into selling?" Fletcher asked, his voice carrying disbelief at the moral implications of such an action. "I think Harold Pemberton is capable of anything that serves his interests," Emma replied, her voice hardening with conviction. "He's already demonstrated that he considers people to be property. Using Indian raids to acquire land would be consistent with his character." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a cavalry patrol from Fort Bowie, led by Lieutenant Morrison, the young officer whose sister had married into a ranching family near Tombstone.
The soldiers had heard the gunfire and come to investigate, their presence a reminder that the military remained responsible for maintaining order in this contested territory. "Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murphy," Lieutenant Morrison said as he dismounted near the main house. "We heard shooting and came to check on your situation. Anyone hurt?" Ben provided a brief account of the morning's events while Emma treated a minor cut on one of the soldiers' hands, her medical skills automatically engaging whenever she encountered injury or illness. Lieutenant Morrison listened with the professional attention of a military officer who understood the strategic implications of organized Apache raids. "This fits a pattern we've been tracking," Morrison said when Ben finished his report. "We've had similar attacks on 3 other ranches in the past month, all well planned and precisely executed. Someone's coordinating these raids, providing intelligence and possibly weapons." Emma's suspicions about Pemberton's involvement grew stronger as she heard this information. The man had the political connections to access information about ranch operations, and his business interests would benefit from forcing settlers to abandon their properties at below-market prices. "Lieutenant, has your investigation identified any common factors among the targeted ranches?" Emma asked, her medical training having taught her to look for patterns in seemingly unrelated events. Morrison consulted his field notes with the precision of a West Point graduate who understood the importance of accurate record-keeping. "All the targeted properties have good water rights and are strategically located along major cattle drives. Someone with knowledge of land values and commercial routes is selecting these targets." Ben and Emma exchanged glances that confirmed their shared suspicions about Pemberton's involvement. The pattern Morrison described matched exactly the kind of systematic land acquisition that would appeal to a man with political ambitions and flexible morals. "Lieutenant, we'd like to share some information that might be relevant to your investigation," Emma said carefully. "We've had some dealings with Harold Pemberton that suggest he might have interests in acquiring ranch properties through intimidation." Morrison's expression grew serious as Emma outlined their confrontation with Pemberton at Fort Bowie, his threats, and his obvious anger at losing his intended bride to a rival. The young officer took careful notes, recognizing the potential significance of Emma's testimony. "Mrs. Murphy, would you be willing to make a formal statement regarding Pemberton's threats? Colonel Henderson has been looking for evidence linking these raids to civilian conspirators." Emma agreed without hesitation, understanding that her testimony might be crucial in building a case against Pemberton and his associates. Her medical training had taught her to be precise and objective in her observations, qualities that would serve her well as a witness in any legal proceedings. As the cavalry patrol prepared to leave, Lieutenant Morrison offered additional protection for the ranch, but Ben declined with polite firmness. "Lieutenant, we appreciate the offer, but we can't run our operation with soldiers standing guard. We'll handle our own security and call for help if the situation gets beyond us." Emma admired her husband's independent spirit, even as she worried about the practical implications of facing organized attacks with limited resources. But she was learning that frontier survival required a careful balance between self-reliance and community cooperation, with each family responsible for its own defense while remaining ready to assist neighbors in crisis. The remainder of the day was spent in defensive preparations that reflected hard-earned experience with frontier violence. Ben and Fletcher organized the ranch hands into overlapping guard shifts, established emergency signals, and created defensive positions that would allow a small number of defenders to hold off larger attacking forces. Emma contributed by organizing medical supplies and establishing a treatment station that could handle multiple casualties. Her Boston training proving valuable in planning for the worst-case scenarios that were always possible in Apache territory. She also began teaching Timothy basic first-aid techniques, understanding that everyone at the ranch needed to be prepared for medical emergencies. Part 7. Conspiracy Unveiled. The letter arrived with the weekly mail delivery from Wilcox, its expensive paper and formal legal language immediately marking it as different from the usual correspondence that reached Murphy Ranch. Emma read it twice before calling Ben in from his work with the horses, her medical training having taught her to be thorough in analyzing important documents. "Benjamin, we need to discuss this immediately," she said, her voice carrying the same clinical concern she'd used when delivering difficult diagnoses to patients in Boston. The letter was from a territorial land commissioner named Augustus Crane, informing them that their property ownership was being challenged based on irregularities in the original survey and filing procedures. According to Crane's carefully worded accusations, the Murphy family claim to their water rights and mineral interests was legally questionable and subject to immediate review. Ben's face darkened as he read the official language, recognizing the legal maneuvers that could be used to strip away everything he'd built through 15 years of hard work and careful planning. "This is Pemberton's work. He couldn't intimidate us with Apache raids, so now he's trying legal pressure." Emma studied the letter with the analytical approach she'd learned during her medical education, looking for inconsistencies and weaknesses in Crane's arguments. "Benjamin, this man Crane is making specific claims about survey errors and filing irregularities. We need to examine our original property documents to see if there's any substance to his accusations." Samuel Fletcher had joined them in the main room, his weathered face creasing with concern as he absorbed the implications of the territorial challenge. As Ben's foreman and oldest friend, Fletcher had helped establish the ranch and possessed intimate knowledge of its legal foundations. "Ben, your father filed those original claims back in '67, right after the war. I was with him when he established the water rights and mineral surveys. Everything was done proper through the territorial office in Tucson." Emma's mind was already working through the legal possibilities, her Boston education having included enough law to understand the tactics being employed against them. "Sam, do we still have the original filing documents? If we can prove that everything was done correctly, we can challenge Crane's accusations." Ben nodded toward the heavy wooden desk that dominated one corner of the main room. "Everything's in the strong box. Dad was meticulous about keeping records, said you couldn't trust the government to remember what they owed you." The examination of their property documents took most of the afternoon, with Emma applying the same methodical approach she'd used in medical diagnosis to analyze the legal papers. What she found was a carefully documented chain of ownership that met or exceeded all territorial requirements for land claims and water rights. "Benjamin, these documents are perfect. Your father surveyed this property with professional precision, filed all the required paperwork, and paid every fee demanded by the territorial government. Crane's accusations are completely without merit." Ben felt relief wash over him like cool water after a day in the desert heat, but his frontier experience had taught him that legal right and practical outcome weren't always the same thing. "Emma, being right on paper doesn't always matter if the judge is crooked or the officials are bought and paid for." Timothy had been listening to this discussion with the intense attention he gave to all adult conversations that might affect his security. The boy had lost his parents to disease and couldn't afford to lose his uncle's ranch to legal maneuvering, making him acutely aware of threats to the family's stability. "Uncle Ben, what happens if the bad men take our ranch away? Where would we live?" Emma's heart ached at the worry in Timothy's voice, recognizing in his question the fear that marked children who'd already experienced too much loss and uncertainty. She reached out to touch his hand, offering the physical comfort that had become natural between them during her recovery. "Timothy, we're not going to lose our home. Sometimes bad people try to take things that don't belong to them, but we have the law on our side and friends who will help us fight for what's right." Ben appreciated Emma's reassurance of Timothy, but his own mind was working through the tactical implications of their situation. If Pemberton was indeed behind both the Apache raids and the legal challenges, he was conducting a coordinated campaign designed to force them off their land through multiple pressure points. "Emma, we need more information about this Augustus Crane. If he's working with Pemberton, There might be evidence of coordination or financial arrangements that we can use to expose the conspiracy. Emma nodded, her medical training having taught her the importance of thorough investigation before making critical decisions. Lieutenant Morrison mentioned that Colonel Henderson was investigating civilian involvement in the Apache raids. Perhaps we should share this letter with him and see what he's learned about territorial officials. Fletcher had been quietly contemplating their options while examining the property documents. His practical frontier experience suggesting approaches that might not occur to people with more formal education. Emma, Ben, what if we took this fight directly to the territorial capital? Make our case to Governor Safford himself before Crane can manipulate the local proceedings. The suggestion had merit, but it would require leaving the ranch at a time when Apache activity remained high and their enemies were actively working to undermine their position. Emma's legs were stronger now, but a journey to Tucson would test her endurance and mobility in ways that could jeopardize her continued recovery. Sam's right about going to the top. Ben agreed, but Emma can't handle that kind of travel yet, and I won't leave her here alone with Apache raiders and Pemberton's threats hanging over us. Emma felt a flash of frustration at being considered an impediment to necessary action. Her independent
spirit chafing at the limitations her injury imposed on the family's options. But her medical training had also taught her to be realistic about physical limitations and recovery timelines. Benjamin, perhaps there's another approach. What if we brought Governor Safford here? Used my medical skills to create a reason for an official visit that would allow us to present our case directly. Ben looked puzzled by this suggestion, unable to see how Emma's medical abilities could influence territorial politics. But Emma was already working through the possibilities. Her knowledge of frontier medicine suggesting an approach that might appeal to practical politicians. The territorial government has been struggling to provide medical services in remote areas. If I offered to establish a medical clinic here at the ranch, serving both settlers and military personnel, it might attract official attention and support. Fletcher's eyes lit up with understanding as he grasped the strategic implications of Emma's proposal. A medical clinic would make this ranch valuable to the territorial government in ways that go beyond land ownership. They couldn't afford to let political manipulation drive away a qualified physician. The plan began to take shape as they discussed the practical details of establishing a frontier medical practice. Emma's Boston training made her uniquely qualified to provide surgical and diagnostic services that were desperately needed in the territory, while her location at Murphy Ranch would make such services accessible to both civilian and military populations. Emma, this could work, Ben said with growing excitement. But we'd need to move quickly before Crane can manipulate the legal proceedings in Pemberton's favor. Emma was already making lists in her mind, cataloging the medical supplies and equipment she would need to establish a proper clinic. Her savings from Boston combined with Ben's resources might be sufficient to purchase the necessary instruments and medications from suppliers in Tucson or even San Francisco. I'll need to send letters to my former instructors at Boston Women's Hospital requesting recommendations for medical suppliers and pharmaceutical companies. With proper equipment, I could provide surgical services that aren't available anywhere else in southern Arizona. Timothy had been following this discussion with fascination, his young mind grasping the possibility that his new aunt's medical skills might save the ranch that Uncle Ben had worked so hard to build. Aunt Emma, would you teach people to be doctors too, like you learned in Boston? Emma smiled at Timothy's question, recognizing in it the intelligent curiosity that marked him as Ben's nephew. Perhaps eventually, Timothy. Right now we need to focus on establishing basic medical services for people who don't have access to any kind of health care. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Harrison from Fort Bowie, his unexpected appearance suggesting either medical emergency or important news that couldn't wait for regular communication. Emma felt immediate concern for the physician who'd been instrumental in her recovery, hoping his visit didn't indicate problems at the military hospital. Dr. Harrison, what brings you out to the ranch? Is everything all right at the fort? Harrison's expression was serious as he dismounted from his horse, his usually calm demeanor suggesting that he carried news of significant importance. Mrs. Murphy, I'm afraid I have disturbing information about your legal situation. Colonel Henderson asked me to warn you personally. Ben and Emma exchanged glances that confirmed their growing suspicion that the legal challenge was connected to larger conspiracies involving territorial officials and business interests. Dr. Harrison's involvement suggested that the military had uncovered evidence of corruption that extended beyond simple land disputes. Doctor, please come inside and tell us what you've learned, Emma said, leading the way into the main room where they could discuss sensitive matters without fear of being overheard by ranch hands or potential eavesdroppers. Harrison accepted a cup of coffee from Timothy before beginning his explanation, his careful words reflecting the gravity of the situation and the potential consequences of the information he was about to share. Mrs. Murphy, Colonel Henderson's investigation has uncovered evidence that Augustus Crane is accepting bribes from private interests to challenge legitimate land claims. He's working with a network of territorial officials who are manipulating the legal system to acquire valuable properties at below-market prices. Emma felt a cold anger settling in her chest as she absorbed this confirmation of their suspicions about the corruption they were facing. Her medical training had taught her to remain calm in crisis situations, but the deliberate injustice represented by Crane's actions tested her professional composure. Dr. Harrison, does Colonel Henderson have enough evidence to bring criminal charges against Crane and his associates? Harrison's expression was grim as he considered the political complexities involved in prosecuting territorial officials. The evidence is strong, but Crane has powerful friends in Tucson and Washington. Building a case that will stand up in territorial court requires witnesses who are willing to testify despite potential retaliation. Ben understood immediately what Harrison was suggesting. Doctor, are you asking us to serve as witnesses against Crane? To put ourselves at risk by testifying about his corrupt practices? Harrison nodded slowly, his physician's training making him reluctant to ask patients to expose themselves to additional stress and danger. Colonel Henderson believes that your case could be the key to exposing the entire conspiracy. Your property documents are so clearly legitimate that Crane's challenge can only be explained by corruption. Emma made her decision with the same clinical certainty she'd used when choosing high-risk surgical procedures that offered the best hope for patient recovery. Dr. Harrison, we'll testify. We'll provide whatever evidence and testimony Colonel Henderson needs to stop this corruption. Ben felt a surge of pride at his wife's courage, recognizing in her commitment the same qualities that had enabled her to survive the stagecoach attack and build a new life from the wreckage of her original plans. Emma was proving herself to be exactly the kind of partner he'd hoped for when he proposed their practical marriage in the desert canyon. Emma, if we do this, we'll be making enemies of some very powerful people. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of fight? Emma met his gaze with the steady determination that had carried her through medical school and recovery from paralysis. Benjamin, some fights choose us whether we're ready or not. At least this time we get to choose which side we're on. Part 8. The Legal Battle. The territorial courthouse in Tucson was an imposing adobe structure that rose from the desert like a monument to the principle that law and order could be imposed even on the wildest frontier. Emma sat in her specially modified wheelchair, her medical bag beside her and her property documents arranged with the precision she'd learned during her surgical training. The journey from the ranch had been difficult, but her determination to fight for their home had overcome the physical challenges of traveling while still recovering from her spinal injury. Augustus Crane proved to be a thin, pale man whose expensive Eastern clothing and soft hands marked him as someone who'd never worked a day in the sun or faced the kind of hardships that defined frontier life. He moved through the courthouse with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his decisions accepted without question, his legal papers carried by assistants who treated him with the deference usually reserved for territorial governors or federal judges. Harold Pemberton sat in the gallery behind Crane's table, his presence confirming Emma's suspicions about the coordination between the legal challenge and the broader conspiracy to acquire valuable ranch properties. His eyes met hers across the courtroom with undisguised malice, his expression suggesting that he viewed this proceeding as personal revenge rather than legitimate legal action. Judge William Morrison was a frontier veteran whose weathered face and careful manner suggested years of experience with the complex legal issues that arose in territorial disputes. Emma had learned from Dr. Harrison that Morrison possessed a reputation for fairness and integrity, qualities that offered hope for honest consideration of their case. Ben sat beside Emma in his best suit, his normally steady hands betraying slight tremors that revealed the stress he felt at potentially losing everything he'd built through 15 years of hard work. Timothy remained at the ranch with Samuel Fletcher, but Emma knew the boy was counting on them to return with news that their home was safe from legal manipulation. "Your Honor," Crane began in a voice that carried the refined accents of Eastern education. "The territorial government has a responsibility to ensure that all land claims are based on accurate surveys and proper legal procedures. The Murphy claim demonstrates irregularities that call into question the validity of their entire ownership." Emma listened to Crane's presentation with the analytical attention she'd learned during medical school, noting the careful way he avoided mentioning specific irregularities while creating an impression of systematic problems with their property claim. His argument was designed to create doubt rather than prove actual errors. Ben's attorney, a local lawyer named James Whitfield who'd agreed to represent them despite the political risks involved, rose to present their defense with documents that Emma had helped organize according to logical sequence and legal relevance. "Your Honor, the Murphy family's land claim represents exactly the kind of careful, legitimate settlement that territorial law was designed to encourage. Every survey was professionally conducted, every fee was paid in full, and every filing was completed according to territorial requirements." Whitfield presented their property documents with methodical precision, each paper accompanied by Emma's detailed analysis of its legal significance and historical context. Her medical training had given her skills in documentation and evidence analysis that proved valuable in legal proceedings. Crane's cross-examination focused on technical details of surveying procedures and filing deadlines, attempting to create confusion about complex regulations that most settlers couldn't be expected to understand completely. But Emma had studied these issues thoroughly, and her testimony remained clear and factual despite Crane's aggressive questioning. "Mrs. Murphy, are you claiming that a woman with medical training is qualified to interpret territorial land law?" Crane asked with condescension that revealed his assumptions about feminine capabilities. Emma met his patronizing tone with the professional composure she'd learned during her hospital training, where male physicians regularly challenged her competence. "Mr. Crane, I'm claiming that anyone with education in logical analysis and document review can recognize the difference between legitimate legal procedures and manufactured accusations." Judge Morrison interrupted Crane's continued questioning with evident impatience. "Mr. Crane, do you have specific evidence of irregularities in the Murphy land claim, or are you simply questioning the competence of the witnesses?" Crane's inability to produce concrete evidence of wrongdoing became increasingly apparent as the proceedings continued. His accusations remained vague and general, lacking the specific documentation that would be required to overturn a legitimate property claim. Emma's testimony about her medical analysis of their property documents proved particularly effective, her scientific training lending credibility to conclusions that might have seemed biased if presented by Ben or his attorney. She'd prepared charts and diagrams that illustrated the proper sequence of legal filings, making complex procedures understandable to judge and jury. The surprise witness was Lieutenant Morrison from Fort Bowie, who testified about Colonel Henderson's investigation into territorial corruption and the pattern of fraudulent challenges to legitimate land claims. His military authority and documented evidence provided crucial support for accusations that Crane was acting on behalf of private interests rather than territorial law. "Lieutenant, in your professional opinion, does the Murphy land claim show any evidence of irregularities that would justify territorial review?" Judge Morrison asked. Morrison's response was precise and unequivocal. "Your Honor, the Murphy property documents represent the most thoroughly documented land claim I've reviewed in 3 years of military service in Arizona Territory. Any challenge to their legitimacy can only be explained by factors other than legal irregularities." Crane's case began to collapse under the weight of evidence and testimony that exposed his accusations as groundless. His final argument relied on procedural technicalities and bureaucratic authority rather than substantive legal issues, revealing the weakness of his position. "Your Honor, the territorial government reserves the right to review any land claim that raises questions about proper procedures, regardless of the apparent legitimacy of the documentation."
Judge Morrison's response reflected his understanding of both territorial law and the practical implications of allowing bureaucratic manipulation to override legitimate property rights. Mr. Crane, territorial authority exists to serve the legitimate interests of Arizona settlers, not to provide opportunities for politically motivated land seizures. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive, dismissing Crane's challenge and affirming the Murphy family's complete ownership of their ranch property and water rights. But Morrison's additional comments revealed his awareness of the broader conspiracy that had prompted the fraudulent legal action. Mr. Crane, this court is referring your conduct in this matter to the Territorial Attorney General for investigation of possible criminal violations. The evidence presented suggests systematic abuse of official authority for private gain. Emma felt overwhelming relief as the legal victory confirmed their right to keep the home they'd built together. But she also understood that their enemies wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. Pemberton's expression as he left the courtroom suggested that other forms of pressure might be employed if legal manipulation had failed. Ben helped Emma into their wagon for the journey back to the ranch, his hands gentle despite the excitement and relief he felt at preserving their property. Emma, we did it. The ranch is ours free and clear, and Crane's going to face criminal charges for his corruption. Emma nodded with satisfaction, but her medical training had taught her to remain alert for complications even after successful treatment. Benjamin, we've won this battle, but I don't think the war is over. Pemberton invested too much in acquiring our property to give up easily. The wagon ride back to Murphy Ranch took them through country that seemed more beautiful now that their ownership was legally secure. Emma watched the familiar landscape of red rocks and desert grass with new appreciation, understanding that this harsh but magnificent land was truly her home now. Timothy ran out to meet them as their wagon approached the ranch buildings, his young face bright with anticipation and worry. Uncle Ben, Aunt Emma, did we get to keep our home? Emma lifted the boy onto her lap despite the pain the movement caused her healing spine, her voice warm with the affection that had grown between them during her recovery. Timothy, the judge said our ranch belongs to us forever. No one can take it away from us. Samuel Fletcher emerged from the main house with news that added urgency to their legal victory. Ben, Emma, glad you're back safe. We've had some interesting visitors while you were gone. Apache delegation came through yesterday, wanted to talk about peace terms. Emma felt immediate interest in this development, her medical training having taught her to look for unexpected opportunities in changing circumstances. Peace with the Apache tribes would eliminate one of the major threats to their ranch operation and create possibilities for cooperation that could benefit both communities. Sam, what kind of peace terms were they discussing? And why would they approach us instead of the military authorities? Fletcher's explanation revealed that the Apache delegation had been led by the same elder warrior who'd granted them sanctuary at the sacred spring during their escape from Devil's Canyon. His respect for Ben's knowledge of Apache customs and Emma's medical skills had prompted him to explore possibilities for peaceful coexistence. Chief Running Wolf said you saved his grandson's life when you treated the boy's bullet wound during that first Apache attack. He wanted to discuss arrangements that would protect the ranch from future raids in exchange for medical treatment for his people. Emma's pulse quickened as she realized the potential significance of this opportunity. Her medical skills could serve as the foundation for peaceful relations with the Apache tribes, creating security for their ranch while providing desperately needed healthcare for indigenous communities. Sam, did Chief Running Wolf leave any specific proposals, or was this just an initial contact to gauge our interest? Fletcher produced a piece of deerskin marked with pictographs that represented the Apache leaders' preliminary terms for peace negotiations. Emma studied the symbols with fascination, recognizing in them a sophisticated communication system that reflected deep cultural knowledge and diplomatic experience. Ben, this could be the solution to our security problems. If we can establish peaceful relations with the Apache tribes, we won't need to worry about raids or warfare affecting our ranch operation. Ben understood the strategic value of Emma's suggestion, But his frontier experience also made him aware of the complex political implications of independent peace negotiations with hostile Indian tribes. The territorial government and military authorities might view such arrangements as interference with official policy. Emma, we'd need to coordinate any peace negotiations with Colonel Henderson and the territorial government. We can't make independent agreements that might conflict with official policy toward the Apache. Emma agreed with Ben's caution, but she also recognized that medical diplomacy might create opportunities that traditional military approaches had failed to achieve. Her skills as a physician could provide neutral ground for negotiations that served everyone's legitimate interests. The evening was spent planning their approach to Apache peace negotiations, with Emma proposing a medical clinic that would serve both settler and indigenous communities while providing a foundation for broader diplomatic cooperation. Her vision of frontier medicine as a bridge between cultures appealed to Ben's practical nature and Samuel Fletcher's experience with interracial cooperation. Part 9. The Apache Alliance chief Running Wolf arrived at Murphy Ranch with the dignity of a man accustomed to command, his weathered face marked by years of warfare and wisdom earned through survival in unforgiving country. He rode alone except for two younger warriors who served as both bodyguards and witnesses to any agreements that might emerge from the negotiations. Emma watched from the porch as the Apache delegation approached, her medical bag ready and her mind prepared for diplomacy that could determine the future of everyone living in this contested territory. The chief's greeting was formal but respectful, acknowledging both Ben's reputation as an honorable adversary and Emma's skills as a healer who'd saved Apache lives despite the ongoing conflict between their peoples. His English was limited but clear, supplemented by hand signs that Ben had learned during his years of frontier warfare. "White woman doctor, your medicine saved my grandson when soldiers' bullets found him. Running Wolf does not forget debts of blood and healing." Emma inclined her head with the same dignity the chief had shown, understanding that this moment represented more than personal gratitude. Her medical intervention during the Apache raid had created a connection that transcended the racial and cultural barriers that usually made peace impossible. "Chief Running Wolf, I am honored by your visit and grateful for the opportunity to discuss how we might help each other. Your grandson's courage in battle was matched by his strength during treatment." Timothy had been coached by Ben about proper behavior during these sensitive negotiations, but the boy's natural curiosity about the Apache visitors was evident in his wide-eyed attention to their traditional clothing and weapons. Emma, Chief Running Wolf's proposal emerged slowly through careful translation and diplomatic courtesy, each word weighted with the gravity of decisions that could mean peace or continued warfare for generations. Emma listened with the clinical attention she'd learned during medical consultations, understanding that misinterpretation could prove as fatal as any battlefield wound. The Apache leader's weathered hands moved with eloquent precision as he outlined terms that reflected both practical necessity and cultural wisdom. His people needed medical care that only Emma could provide, while the Murphy Ranch required security that Apache warriors could guarantee better than any cavalry patrol. "White woman doctor, my people suffer from wounds that do not heal, sickness that kills children and elders. Your medicine stopped death when it reached for my grandson. Running Wolf offers protection of sacred oath in exchange for healing hands that serve Apache and white man equally." Emma felt the weight of opportunity and responsibility settling on her shoulders like a mantle of leadership she'd never sought but couldn't refuse. Her medical training had prepared her to save lives regardless of race or politics, while her experience on the frontier had taught her that survival often depended on unlikely alliances. Ben watched his wife consider the chief's proposal with growing admiration for her courage and vision. Most frontier women would have seen only danger in treating hostile Indians, but Emma recognized the possibility of creating something unprecedented in Arizona territory: genuine peace built on mutual benefit rather than military superiority. "Chief Running Wolf, I accept your proposal with honor and gratitude. I will treat Apache patients with the same skill and dedication I give to any person who needs medical care. But I must also treat white settlers and soldiers as my oath as a physician requires me to serve all who suffer. The chief's nod indicated both understanding and approval of Emma's medical ethics. His own experience as a war leader had taught him that healers must remain neutral to maintain their effectiveness, just as sacred springs must remain accessible to all people regardless of their tribal affiliations. Timothy had been following this negotiation with fascination, his young mind grasping the historical importance of the moment while struggling to understand the complex emotions involved. He'd grown up hearing stories of Apache raids and violence, but seeing Chief Running Wolf's dignity and wisdom challenged his inherited assumptions about Indian character. Samuel Fletcher emerged from the barn where he'd been maintaining a respectful distance during the diplomatic discussions, his presence adding weight to any agreements that might be reached. His reputation among both white settlers and Apache warriors as a man of integrity made him a valuable witness to peace negotiations. The practical details of the medical alliance took shape through careful discussion of locations, procedures,
and protocols that would protect both communities while ensuring effective healthcare delivery. Emma proposed establishing treatment days at neutral locations where Apache patients could receive care without exposing tribal movements to military observation. I suggest we use the sacred spring where your people granted us sanctuary. It's neutral ground that both sides respect, with clean water essential for medical procedures and sufficient space for treating multiple patients. Chief Running Wolf's approval was immediate and enthusiastic. The spring held spiritual significance that would make it an appropriate location for healing activities, while its distance from both the ranch and Apache camps would provide security for everyone involved. Ben recognized the tactical advantages of Emma's proposal, understanding that the sacred spring's neutral status would prevent their medical activities from being interpreted as either military intelligence gathering or tribal collaboration by suspicious authorities on either side. Emma, the spring location makes sense from every angle. It's defensible if someone tries to interfere with your medical work, but isolated enough that nervous officials won't worry about security breaches. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Harold Pemberton with a larger entourage than his previous visit, including additional hired gunmen and a man whose bearing suggested military or law enforcement background. Emma felt immediate tension as she recognized the aggressive posture that marked Pemberton's group as prepared for violence rather than negotiation. Chief Running Wolf's warriors reacted to the newcomers with fluid movements that positioned them for combat while maintaining the appearance of casual alertness. Emma realized that her medical negotiations had placed everyone at the ranch in potential danger from multiple directions. Murphy, I see you're entertaining guests without considering the implications for other white settlers in the territory. Consorting with hostile Indians could be interpreted as treason by territorial authorities. Pemberton's accusation carried undertones of threat that went beyond legal consequences, suggesting that he possessed connections capable of manipulating both civilian and military justice systems. Emma recognized in his words the same calculating malice that had marked his earlier attempts to acquire her person and Ben's property. Ben stepped forward to place himself between Pemberton's group and the Apache delegation, his hand resting casually near his gun belt in a gesture that communicated readiness without provocation. Pemberton, Chief Running Wolf is here under a flag of truce to discuss medical arrangements. Any interference with peaceful negotiations would violate both territorial law and military protocols. Emma's mind was working rapidly through the diplomatic implications of this confrontation. Understanding that violence between Pemberton's group and the Apache delegation could destroy any possibility of peaceful cooperation, while providing Pemberton with justification for military intervention against the ranch. Mr. Pemberton, these negotiations concern medical treatment for injured people, not political or military agreements. As a licensed physician, I have both the right and the duty to provide healthcare to anyone who requests it, regardless of their race or political status. Pemberton's response revealed the depth of his frustration at being repeatedly thwarted in his attempts to acquire the Murphy Ranch through legal, military, or economic pressure. His carefully maintained facade of respectability was beginning to crack under the strain of persistent failure. Miss Murphy, your medical activities with hostile Indians constitute a clear threat to territorial security. I'm prepared to report your treasonous collaboration to the appropriate military and civilian authorities. Chief Running Wolf had remained silent during this exchange, but his understanding of English was sufficient to grasp the threats being directed at Emma and her family. His response demonstrated the diplomatic skill that had enabled him to survive decades of warfare while maintaining his people's independence. White man with soft hands speaks of treason while threatening woman doctor who saves lives. Running wolf knows honor when he sees it, knows cowardice when it speaks with forked tongue. The insult was delivered with the quiet dignity that made it more devastating than any shouted challenge. Pemberton's face flushed with anger at being publicly characterized as dishonorable by an Apache chief, his reaction revealing the racial prejudices that governed his worldview. The standoff was broken by the arrival of Lieutenant Morrison and a cavalry patrol from Fort Bowie, their timing suggesting either remarkable coincidence or careful planning by someone who'd anticipated potential trouble. Emma felt relief as she recognized the young officer who'd testified in their legal case against territorial corruption. "Mr. Pemberton, Chief Running Wolf, I understand there's a medical consultation taking place here. Colonel Henderson asked me to observe and ensure that territorial interests are properly protected." Morrison's diplomatic language indicated his awareness of the delicate political situation while establishing military oversight that would prevent either side from taking actions that could escalate into broader conflict. Emma recognized in his presence the protection they needed to continue their peace negotiations. Pemberton clearly felt frustrated by the military intervention, but his political connections weren't sufficient to override direct orders from Fort Bowie's commanding officer. His retreat was grudging but inevitable, though his parting words carried promises of future interference. "Lieutenant Morrison, I trust you'll file a complete report about these unauthorized negotiations with hostile Indians. The territorial government has legitimate concerns about civilian interference in military affairs." As Pemberton's group departed, Chief Running Wolf completed his discussions with Emma about medical protocols and treatment schedules, their agreement sealed with the formal dignity that marked important tribal decisions. Emma felt a profound sense of accomplishment at achieving something that professional diplomats and military officers had failed to accomplish. White woman doctor, Running Wolf's word is sacred bond. Apache warriors protect medicine woman and her family as long as healing hands serve all people with equal skill. The immediate transformation in ranch security was remarkable, with Apache scouts taking positions that provided early warning of any threats while remaining invisible to casual observation. Emma realized that she'd gained protectors whose knowledge of desert warfare exceeded anything the territorial military could provide. Ben watched these developments with growing appreciation for his wife's diplomatic skills, understanding that her medical alliance with the Apache had solved security problems that had threatened their ranch operation for years. Emma's vision of neutral healthcare had created peace where conventional approaches had only produced endless conflict. Timothy's reaction to their new Apache allies reflected the adaptability of childhood, his initial fear giving way to fascination as he observed warriors whose skills and knowledge differed dramatically from anything he'd encountered in his sheltered ranch life. The weeks that followed established patterns of cooperation that gradually expanded beyond medical treatment to include trade relationships and information sharing that benefited both communities. Emma's clinic at the Sacred Spring became a symbol of successful coexistence that attracted attention from territorial officials seeking alternatives to expensive military solutions. Dr. Harrison visited from Fort Bowie to observe Emma's innovative medical practice, his professional curiosity about frontier medicine combining with official interest in peaceful Apache relations. His report to Colonel Henderson praised both the medical effectiveness and diplomatic success of Emma's neutral healthcare approach. "Mrs. Murphy, your medical alliance with Chief Running Wolf represents exactly the kind of practical cooperation that territorial authorities should be encouraging. You've achieved more progress toward lasting peace in 3 months than the military accomplished in 3 years." Emma's reputation as both skilled physician and successful diplomat began attracting patients from throughout southern Arizona, with settlers and Apache alike traveling considerable distances to receive medical care that was unavailable elsewhere in the territory. Her practice grew beyond anything she'd imagined possible when she'd first arrived as a desperate mail-order bride. The financial success of Emma's medical practice, combined with the security provided by their Apache alliance, enabled Ben to expand his ranch operations into areas that had previously been too dangerous for cattle grazing.
Their partnership had evolved from necessity into genuine prosperity built on mutual respect and complementary skills. Harold Pemberton's final attempt at revenge came 6 months later, when he returned with federal marshals and accusations of illegal treaty-making with hostile Indians. But Emma's careful documentation of her medical activities, combined with testimony from both military officers and territorial officials, exposed his charges as politically motivated persecution. The federal investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Pemberton's corrupt activities, including his involvement in fraudulent land schemes, illegal weapons sales to hostile Indians, and conspiracy to manipulate territorial courts for personal gain. His arrest and prosecution removed a major threat to peaceful settlement throughout Arizona Territory. Chief Running Wolf's prediction that Emma's medical diplomacy would inspire broader cooperation proved accurate as other Apache bands sought similar arrangements with white settlements. Her success became a model for peaceful coexistence that influenced territorial policy toward indigenous peoples throughout the Southwest. Emma's personal recovery continued alongside her professional success, with her legs gradually regaining strength and mobility through the physical demands of frontier medical practice. She would never fully recover from her spinal injury, but her limitations became less important as her contributions to frontier life grew more significant. Ben's respect and affection for his wife deepened as he watched her transform from a desperate stranger into a community leader whose medical skills and diplomatic wisdom earned recognition throughout the territory. Their marriage of convenience had become a love story that inspired other frontier couples facing seemingly impossible challenges. Timothy flourished under the combined influence of Ben's steady guidance and Emma's intellectual stimulation, his education encompassing both traditional academic subjects and practical frontier skills that would serve him well in adult life. His easy relationships with both white settlers and Apache visitors demonstrated the possibility of transcending racial prejudices through personal experience. Samuel Fletcher's role evolved from ranch foreman to business partner as the Murphy operation expanded to include Emma's medical practice and the trade relationships that grew from their Apache alliance. His loyalty to Ben and respect for Emma created a family bond that extended beyond blood relationships. The Murphy Ranch became a symbol of successful frontier adaptation, where courage, intelligence, and determination had overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles to create something unprecedented in Arizona Territory. Visitors came from as far as California and Texas to observe their innovative approaches to healthcare, security, and interracial cooperation. Emma often reflected on the stagecoach crash that had seemed to end her life but had actually begun it, understanding that her greatest achievements had grown from her darkest moments. Her paralysis had taught her that strength came in many forms, while her desperate marriage had shown her that love could develop from the most practical foundations. 2 years after their wedding, Emma stood in the doorway of her medical clinic watching Ben work with Timothy to repair fence posts damaged by the previous night's storm. Her legs still ached after long days of medical practice, but her heart was full with the knowledge that they'd built something lasting and meaningful in this harsh but magnificent country. The mail from Boston brought news that her former colleagues had established a frontier medicine program based on her documented experiences in Arizona Territory. Medical students were being trained specifically for frontier practice, with Emma's techniques for neutral healthcare serving as the foundation for diplomatic medicine throughout the American West. Chief Running Wolf's grandson, now fully recovered from his bullet wound, had begun learning medical techniques from Emma while teaching her advanced Apache knowledge of desert survival and plant medicine. Their collaboration represented the kind of cultural exchange that was gradually transforming frontier society from conflict to cooperation. The sacred spring where Emma held her medical clinics had become a pilgrimage destination for people seeking healing that encompassed both physical treatment and spiritual renewal. Apache and white patients often found themselves working together to maintain the site and assist with medical procedures, creating friendships that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. Emma's letters to medical journals in Boston and Philadelphia documented frontier healthcare techniques that were being adopted by physicians throughout the American West. Her innovation in combining Eastern medical education with frontier practicality was influencing the development of uniquely American approaches to medical practice. The Murphy Ranch prospered beyond Ben's most optimistic projections, with their cattle operation benefiting from Apache knowledge of water sources and grazing areas that had been unknown to white settlers. Emma's medical income supplemented their ranch profits while providing health care that saved lives throughout southern Arizona. The evening that marked their second wedding anniversary found Emma and Ben sitting on their porch watching Timothy practice reading with assistance from young Apache children who visited the ranch regularly. The scene represented everything they'd hoped to achieve when they'd made their desperate bargain in Devil's Canyon. "Emma, do you ever regret the choices that brought you here?" Ben asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity about her feelings toward the life they'd built together. Emma considered the question with the same thoughtful attention she gave to difficult medical diagnoses, weighing the losses against the gains that had marked her transformation from desperate mail-order bride to respected frontier physician and diplomat. "Benjamin, I regret the pain and suffering that brought us together, but I could never regret the life we've created. I came to Arizona Territory expecting to marry a stranger and instead found a partner who helped me become someone I never imagined I could be." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young woman traveling alone in a wagon loaded with possessions that suggested either migration or flight from some difficult circumstance. Emma recognized in her worn clothing and determined expression the same desperate hope that had marked her own arrival in Arizona Territory. "Ma'am, I'm looking for the Murphy Ranch. I heard there might be work here for someone with teaching experience. I'm Margaret Sinclair from Kansas, and I'm afraid I'm rather down on my luck." Emma exchanged glances with Ben that communicated their shared understanding of opportunity and responsibility. Their own success had grown from the kindness of strangers and the willingness of others to take chances on desperate people, creating obligations to extend similar opportunities to those who followed in their footsteps. "Miss Sinclair, you've found the Murphy Ranch, and you're welcome here. I'm Emma Murphy, and this is my husband Benjamin. We've learned that people who are down on their luck often possess exactly the qualities that frontier life requires most." Ben nodded his agreement while helping Margaret down from her wagon, his actions reflecting the same generous spirit that had prompted him to rescue Emma from the desert canyon. "Miss Sinclair, we can always use help with Timothy's education, and Emma's medical practice has grown large enough to require administrative assistance." Timothy emerged from the house with the easy confidence that marked his adjustment to frontier life, his greeting of the newcomer reflecting the social skills he'd learned from watching Emma work with patients from diverse backgrounds. "Miss Sinclair, are you going to be our new teacher? Aunt Emma has been teaching me about medicine, but Uncle Ben says I need to learn regular school subjects too." Margaret's smile at Timothy's enthusiastic welcome revealed both relief at finding sanctuary and recognition of the opportunity to rebuild her life in circumstances that offered dignity along with employment. Emma could see in her face the same mixture of hope and determination that had carried her through her own darkest moments. As evening settled over Murphy Ranch, Emma helped Margaret settle into the guest room that had become a way station for travelers seeking new beginnings in Arizona Territory. The cycle of rescue and renewal that had begun with Emma's own desperate arrival was continuing with each person who found refuge and opportunity at their desert home. The Apache warriors who provided security for the ranch maintained their vigil from invisible positions among the rocks and brush, their presence a reminder that peace required constant vigilance even as it enabled prosperity. Emma's medical diplomacy had created unprecedented cooperation, but the broader conflicts of frontier expansion continued beyond their small oasis of tranquility. Ben's final task each evening was checking the security of their water rights and livestock, responsibilities that connected him to the land in ways that went beyond mere ownership. The ranch represented not just property but a way of life that required constant attention and adaptation to survive and flourish in harsh country. Emma's medical journal recorded not only patient treatments but observations about frontier society and the evolution of American civilization in territories that tested every assumption about law, order, and human cooperation. Her documentation would eventually contribute to scholarly understanding of Western expansion and cultural adaptation. Timothy's bedtime stories now included both traditional fairy tales and accounts of real adventures involving Apache chiefs, frontier physicians, and cattle ranchers who'd learned to work together despite differences that had once seemed insurmountable. His childhood was being shaped by examples of courage and cooperation that would influence his adult character. The stars over Arizona territory shone with the same brilliant intensity that had guided travelers and dreamers across the desert for countless generations. Their light falling equally on Apache camps and white settlements that were gradually learning to share the vast landscape that offered abundance for those wise enough to cooperate rather than fight. Emma's last thoughts before sleep often returned to the stagecoach crash that had seemed to end her life but had actually begun her greatest adventure. She'd lost the use of her legs but gained a family, a community, and a purpose that fulfilled her deepest aspirations for meaningful contribution to human welfare and understanding. The morning would bring new patients to her clinic, new challenges to their ranch operation, and new opportunities to demonstrate that peace and prosperity were possible even in the most hostile environments when people chose cooperation over conflict and service over selfishness. The Murphy Ranch stood as testament to the possibility of transformation through courage, intelligence, and mutual respect. Its success inspiring others throughout the American West to seek innovative solutions to the challenges of frontier expansion and cultural coexistence. Emma's journey from desperate mail-order bride to respected frontier leader had created ripples of positive change that would influence generations of Western settlers. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.